The summer of 1932 had been merciless across the plains of Kansas. The land was cracked and dry, the sky stretched endlessly overhead like a dome of brass, and the dust storms had become so common that people spoke of them with the same tiredness as they once spoke of rain. Ethan Miller had been walking for nearly 2 days without food, drifting from town to town in search of honest work. His boots were worn thin, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and each step felt heavier than the last. But he kept moving because stopping meant surrender, and he had nothing left but his stubborn will. He had been a farmhand all his life, raised among rows of corn and wheat, learning the rhythm of planting and harvest from his father. But when the Depression hit and the banks swallowed up the farms one by one, men like Ethan became wanderers overnight. He had tried the cities, where soup kitchens woon around blocks and jobs vanished as quickly as they were whispered about, but desperation had driven him back to the countryside. It was here, on the outskirts of a town called Fairview, that he saw a farmhouse rising from the haze like a mirage. The house was large, with white paint peeling gently from its wooden boards, and surrounded by a wide porch that seemed to hug it protectively. Though the fields around it were tidy, there was a silence that unsettled him. No children played, no dogs barked, no men worked the land. It was a place alive yet strangely still. Ethan hesitated at the gate, his hand gripping the weathered wood, wondering if he had the strength to beg once more. Pride had long been stripped from him, but each time he asked for work or bread, something in his chest twisted painfully. He walked up the gravel path and knocked on the door. For a moment, there was no sound except the faint chirping of cicadas. Then the door creaked open, and she appeared. Margaret Hayes, the widow of Fairview, stood in the doorway with her dark dress pressed neatly against her tall frame. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back tightly, but her fascia, though lined with years, retained a sharp beauty that commanded respect. Her eyes were piercing, gray as a storm about to break, and they lingered on Ethan with a quiet intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neither cold nor warm, but measured, as though weighing the value of each syllable. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. He explained that he was looking for work, any work, no matter how small, on her farm. His words tumbled out, raw with hunger and humility. He told her he could mend fences, tend livestock, plow fields, or chop wood. All he asked was a place to sleep in the barn and enough food to keep his strength. When he finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Margaret did not move immediately. She studied him as though he were a puzzle she had been given to solve. He was young, perhaps 25, though hardship had carved shadows beneath his eyes and hollowed his cheeks. There was honesty in his tone, she could tell, but also desperation. Finally, she stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. Ethan hesitated, uncertain, but hunger pushed him forward. The house smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, and though it was neat, it felt empty, as though waiting for voices that never came. She led him to the kitchen, where a half-filled teapot sat cooling on the stove. She poured him a glass of water and set it on the table. "You want work," she said simply. Ethan nodded quickly, grateful even for the drink. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do anything you ask. Just give me a chance." Margaret's eyes softened slightly, though her lips remained a thin line. She sat across from him, folding her hands neatly, and let the silence stretch once again. Then, in a voice as steady as before, she said, "I'll give you work, but only if you'll marry me by sunset." The words struck Ethan like a hammer to the chest, and he nearly choked on his water. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. Marry her? Surely it was a cruel jest, a trick to see how low he might stoop. He blinked, staring at her, but her expression betrayed no hint of humor. She was deadly serious. "Mama broken bar, I don't understand," he stammered. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. I live alone on this farm. My husband has been gone 5 years now. The neighbors whisper, the town pities me, but none of that matters. What matters is this place and my future here. If you want a life here, Ethan Miller, you must tie it to mine. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest. Marriage had never crossed his mind. He had dreamed of work, of survival, of saving enough money to perhaps send for his younger sister in Missouri. To wed a woman he had only just met seemed madness. Yet her offer was not one of jest but of solemnity. He could see it in the way her eyes held his, unwavering and almost pleading beneath the strength. She was lonely, yes, but there was something else to her urgency, as though time itself pressed upon her shoulders. He swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the water. He tried to speak, but words failed him. Margaret rose, moving gracefully though slowly, and crossed to the window. She pulled back the curtain, revealing fields stretching into the distance. By sunset, she repeated quietly, her voice tinged with finality. That is my condition. You will either be my husband before the day ends, or you will leave this farm as you found it. The certainty in her tone sent a shiver through him. He stared at her back, at the proud line of her shoulders, and felt the weight of choice settle upon him like a stone. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but fear gnawed at his soul. He left the house in a daze, stumbling back down the path toward the gate. The sun blazed high in the sky, and the hours between now and dusk seemed both endless and fleeting. He sat beneath a tree near the edge of her property, his mind whirling. Marry her by sunset. Could he bind himself to a stranger simply for the promise of work and food? And yet, what choice did he truly have? He had no money, no family nearby, no prospects. The road had offered him nothing but dust and despair. Perhaps this was the strange twist of fate he had been waiting for. As he sat there, memories of his father's voice returned to him. A man must plant roots somewhere, Ethan, his father used to say. A life without land, without family, is no life at all. Ethan had scoffed then, dreaming of adventure beyond the fields. But now, hollow with hunger and worn by wandering, those words struck him differently. Maybe roots didn't always come as a man expected. Maybe they were offered suddenly, like a door opening where there had been only walls. He looked back at the farmhouse, its windows glinting in the sun, and wondered what secrets lived inside with the widow. The townsfolk had spoken of Margaret Hayes in hushed tones as he passed through earlier that morning. They said she had turned away suitors, that she had refused offers to sell her land, that she lived with ghosts in that big empty house. Some called her proud, others lonely, but none truly knew her. Ethan thought of her eye as a sharp and commanding, yet carrying an ache he couldn't quite name. She was not a woman to trifle with, that much was clear. If he agreed, he would not merely gain a place to sleep and bread to eat. He would be bound to her, perhaps forever. The afternoon dragged, each hour pulling him deeper into thought. He walked the edge of her fields, noting how well kept they were despite the absence of farmhands. Fences were sturdy, crops lined in neat rows, and the barn stood tall without sign of neglect. She had managed all this alone, or perhaps with brief help from hired men long gone. The realization filled him with respect, even admiration. Margaret Hayes was no fragile widow waiting to be saved. She was a fortress unto herself. And yet, for all her strength, she had asked for him not as a worker, but as a husband. The paradox unsettled him. By the time the shadows began to lengthen, Ethan's resolve had not yet formed, but hunger and exhaustion pushed him toward a decision. He rose from beneath the tree and walked back toward the house, his legs heavy as though wading through water. The air had cooled slightly, and the horizon shimmered with hints of gold. The farmhouse loomed before him once more, steady and unyielding, a symbol of permanence he had not known in years. As he reached the steps of the porch, his heart pounded with the weight of the choice he was about to make. Inside, Margaret Hayes awaited his answer. Ethan stood at the threshold of the farmhouse, the evening sun lowering behind him, staining the horizon with streaks of orange and crimson. The air carried the scent of dry earth and fading summer, and the sound of cicadas echoed faintly across the fields. He hesitated, gripping the railing of the porch as if to steady himself. Every instinct in him screamed that this was no ordinary choice. To marry a stranger, a widow no less, was to bind himself to a future that had no certainty. But the hunger in his belly and the loneliness in his heart whispered that perhaps certainty was overrated. Margaret Hayes opened the door before he could knock, as if she had known he would return. Her gray eyes studied him calmly, betraying neither triumph nor surprise. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Ethan obeyed, his boots creaking softly against the polished floorboards. The house smelled faintly of bread baking, though he had seen no sign of preparation earlier. It was as though she had expected this moment, had prepared for it with the same precision she tended her fields. A shiver ran through him, not of fear, but of awe at her quiet command. Inside the parlor, a small table had been arranged. A vase of freshly cut sunflowers, bright and golden, rested at its center. A local preacher, Reverend Clark, sat in a chair near the window, his hat resting on his lap. He looked up as Ethan entered, his lined face breaking into a polite but curious smile. Ethan's heart quickened. Margaret had not only expected his answer but had summoned a witness, a man of God, to bind the union. There was no turning back now without shame. She had orchestrated the evening like a conductor arranging a solemn symphony. The widow turned to Ethan, her voice calm, measured. "Do you accept?" she asked. The words were simple, yet the weight of them seemed to fill the room. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at the preacher, who waited silently, and then at the flowers on the table, bright against the fading light. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice low but steady. Margaret inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging not victory but inevitability. She moved to stand beside him, her presence steady, unshaken. For her, this was not romance or desperation, it was resolve, the final step of a decision long made. Reverend Clark rose, clearing his throat softly, and opened his Bible. His voice carried the familiar cadence of Scripture, solemn and practiced. Ethan barely heard the words, his mind drifting in and out of the moment. He saw the sun sinking lower through the window, the shadows lengthening across the floor, the flicker of dust motes floating in the golden air. When the preacher asked for his vow, Ethan spoke softly, promising to honor and remain by her side. Margaret answered with equal calm, her voice unshaken, almost businesslike, though beneath it he caught a faint quiver, a trace of vulnerability quickly concealed. The ceremony ended as simply as it had begun. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Clark intoned, "I pronounce you husband and wife." His words lingered in the air like a bell tolling. Ethan turned toward Margaret, uncertain of what was expected. She met his gaze steadily, then offered him her hand. He took it, the touch surprisingly warm. For the first time that day, she smiled, and not widely, not with giddy joy, but with quiet relief, as though a burden she had carried alone had finally shifted. Ethan felt a strange stirring in his chest, something more complex than gratitude, less fleeting than hunger. After the preacher departed, Margaret led Ethan to the dining room. A simple meal awaited them, fresh bread, roasted chicken, and potatoes, all arranged neatly as though prepared for honored guests. Ethan's stomach growled audibly, and Margaret's lips twitched with the faintest amusement. "Eat," she said gently, motioning for him to sit. He did not need to be told twice. Each bite was a revelation, filling the hollowness that had haunted him for days. Across the table, Margaret ate sparingly, her eyes fixed on him with quiet satisfaction, as though feeding him was a victory greater than the vows themselves. The house, though quiet, seemed fuller now. As the oil lamp flickered on the table, Ethan found his gaze drifting around the room. Photographs lined the mantel, images of Margaret's late husband, a stern man with a neatly trimmed mustache, and of fields once greener, harvests once abundant. A heaviness settled in Ethan's chest. He had not replaced that man, nor could he. He was merely stepping into a role carved by absence, a companion to silence. Yet Margaret's gaze softened as she noticed his eyes on the pictures. "The past is behind us," she said firmly. "Tonight, we look forward." After supper, Margaret guided him to the porch. The night had deepened, stars glittering across the vast Kansas sky. The air was cooler, and the land stretched in serene stillness. Ethan leaned against the railing, his mind still tangled with the strangeness of the day. Margaret stood beside him, her hands folded neatly, her presence both commanding and comforting. "You wonder why," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by her candor. She did not wait for him to answer. "I have lived alone long enough. A house without voices becomes a tomb. A farm without a future becomes dust. I will not let that happen." Her words struck him deeply, resonating with his own fears. He had wandered for so long, rootless and uncertain, afraid of becoming nothing more than another forgotten drifter. Perhaps they were not so different, he realized. She feared emptiness, he feared insignificance, and in their union lay the chance of salvation for them both. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Margaret studied him a moment longer, then turned her gaze back to the stars. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but companionable, filled with the quiet possibility of something new taking root. As the days that followed unfolded, Ethan settled into his role not just as a farmhand but as a husband. He rose early, worked the fields with renewed vigor, and found satisfaction in the rhythm of labor once more. Margaret watched him carefully, sometimes offering instruction, sometimes simply observing with a gaze both critical and approving. They spoke little at first, their conversations practical, revolving around chores and necessities. But gradually, words softened, and silences became less awkward. Ethan began to notice the subtle kindness beneath her stern exterior, the way she left a cup of coffee steaming for him at dawn, the way she sewed a tear in his shirt without comment. At night, they sat on the porch together, the crickets chirping, the horizon glowing faintly with the promise of another day. Their bond was not one of passion, but of necessity tempered into respect. Yet within that respect, something fragile and unexpected began to grow. Ethan found himself listening for her footsteps, watching the way her eyes brightened when she spoke of the farm's history. Margaret, in turn, began to relax the armor she had built around her heart, letting him see glimpses of the woman beneath it, the one who laughed softly at a clumsy remark, who admitted she had feared the long winters most when alone. Their marriage, born of desperation, became a partnership forged in resilience. Ethan realized he was no longer merely surviving, he was building something of roots, as his father had once spoken of. Margaret, once the lonely widow of Fairview, no longer walked the halls of her house in silence. She had a companion, a confidant, someone to share the weight of both grief and hope. By sunset of that first day, they had been strangers bound by words. By sunset weeks later, they had become two souls learning to walk together, not out of duty alone, but out of a shared longing for belonging. The widow's condition had seemed strange, almost cruel, when first spoken. But in the stillness of their nights and the labor of their days, Ethan came to understand it fully. Margaret had not sought a farmhand, she had sought a future,